What's up, babes? It's Alex or Black Guy here, and this is the SMITE 9.12 update in 7 minutes. This update is a little bit smaller than normal, especially when it comes to balance, because Hi-Rez doesn't want to shift up the meta too much before the World Championship. As always, this will not be an in-depth review of every single change, and will just be more of a general overview. If you would like to see the patch notes more in-depth, then I'd recommend watching a different video that goes more in-depth or reading the patch notes yourself. Without further ado, let's begin. As always, we'll begin with the skins. First off, we have Tokyo Machine Loki, Nidhogger Jormungandr, Spellblaster Charybdis, Lunar Lightning Ishtar, Infinite Wave Poseidon, and SWC Challenger Thanatos. 2 weeks later during the bonus update, we are getting Foxgirl 9 Daji, Hellraider Hercules, and Gecko Taverner Cabrakan. Another 2 weeks later in January, we're getting Cannon Crusader Vulcan, AP-15 Alpwash, and Claw of the Deep Khepri. This next section I'm going to combine Smite Night with, because every week of Smite Night will consist of Smite's newest adventure, Odin's Onslaught. Odin's Onslaught will feature 5 teams of 2, so 2 versus 2 versus 2 versus 2 versus 2, with the goal of reaching the bounty threshold of 35,000 gold. You will start at level 3, start with 3,000 gold, and will feature a variety of zones: the autumnal home of the elves, the wintry home of the giants, a temperate realm of man, and the bleak shore of corpses in Helheim. There is also a list of banned gods and items, and if you would like to see more information, then just pause the screen. There is a lot to this new adventure, but since this is a patch notes recap, I am just going to recommend that you look at the actual patch notes yourself, as if I went over every single thing in this adventure, this video would be triple the length. Just know that there are a variety of brand new camps, jungle bosses, and objectives. Moving on to bug fixes. Again, there are a lot of bug fixes in every single patch, but I'm just going to highlight the ones that I think were notable. Firstly, they fixed a bug with PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 4, where some of the models were having low quality textures. They fixed an issue with Persephone where she could Aegis in her passive state. And finally, they fixed a variety of Maui issues. They fixed an issue where he could fall through the map. They fixed an issue where his first ability could damage 2 gods if the first god died on hit. They fixed an issue where sometimes enemies weren't getting knocked up by the ultimate. And finally, they fixed an issue where you could knock up enemies onto some geometry on the Jade Corruption Joust map. Moving on to game mode changes, they're actually adding 5v5 ranked conquest, but it's not what it seems at first glance. Between December 13th and December 20th, you will be allowed to queue ranked conquest in a party of any size. Also, it's worth noting that ranked joust will be disabled for this time period. This queue will actually take your current ranked conquest progress and then give you TP and MMR towards future ranked conquest matches played in the normal solo queue or duo queue game mode. But the queue will be on a very long timer, expected only to proc 3 times per day. The queues will proc at roughly 10 AM, 6 PM, and 2 AM Eastern Standard Time. Finally, it's worth noting that this is more of an experiment rather than a guaranteed permanent game mode. And finally, the Conquest map is going to change in preparation for the SMITE World Championship. For example, the SMITE World Championship trophy will be placed at the Fire Giant, SPL logos will be found on the ground in the mid lane, SPL banners hang in the Order and Chaos bases, and previous SMITE World Championship champion skin statues, holy fuck that was a mouthful, will be placed around the map. Finally, we can move on to the balance updates. Again, as I said in the introduction, there weren't too many changes for this update, mainly because they don't want to shake up the meta too much for the SMITE World Championship. Let's begin with the items. Mannequin Scepter. That's it. Mannequin Scepter will now do decreased damage to gods, and the minion damage will remain the same. Moving on to the gods, we'll start with Anhur, whose third ability is seeing a decrease in cooldown. Next we have Ao Kuang, whose third ability is getting a decrease in mana cost and a decrease in cooldown. Next up we have Cuchulainn, whose base damage on his first ability is being increased by 10 at all ranks in both his normal stance and his rage stance. And finally, Cuchulainn's ultimate is also seeing an increase in base damage. Next up we have Hebo, who is only getting a buff to his base stats. They're increasing his base movement speed by 5 and increasing the base HP per level by 5 as well. And next up we have Heimdallr, whose first ability is seeing an increase in base damage at the earlier ranks, but staying the same at max rank. Next up we have Jormungandr, whose first and second ability is seeing a decrease in cooldown by 1 second. Then we have Ishtar, whose first ability is seeing an increase in cooldown by 1 second, and seeing a decrease in damage on Storm Shot by 5% of Ishtar's basic attack damage. Next up we have Maui, who is actually getting a good bit of buffs. His first ability is seeing an increase in base damage scaled towards the later ranks. The range of this ability at 0 charge is being increased from 4 to 25, and they are decreasing the time it takes to reach the max range charge from 1.4 seconds to 1 second. Finally, Maui's second ability is seeing a shift in movement speed, where instead of going from 4 to 20% movement speed as you level it up, it now goes from 8 to 16% movement speed as you level it up. And also the protections this ability provides is getting a straight buff by 10 at every single rank. Next up we have Neith, who's getting some pretty big buffs. Her second ability is getting a decrease in cooldown by 1 second, and her third ability will now pass through all player-made walls. Next up we have Tiamat, whose first ability in her mage stance is getting an increase in base damage per shot. Next up we have Tsukiyomi, whose second ability is seeing an increase in base damage from only the final hit by 10 at every single rank, and the scaling of the final hit is being increased by 10% as well. Finally, we have Ymir, whose first ability is getting a shift in both the wall lifetime and the cooldown. The lifetime of Ymir's wall, instead of lasting between 2 and 6 seconds depending on what rank it is, it will now be between 2.5 seconds and 4.5 seconds depending on what rank it is. And finally, for the cooldown, instead of being from 14 seconds to 10 seconds depending on what rank it is, it will now be 13 seconds at all ranks. Thank you guys for watching. I am extremely excited for the SMITE World Championship in January, and I will see you in the next video. Next up we have Jormungandr, whose first ability is seeing a decrease in cooldown by 1. Next up we have Jormungandr, whose... What the fuck? Next up we have Tsukiyomi, whose second ability is seeing an increase in base damage but... Next up we have Tsukiyomi, whose base... Oh my fucking fuck dick ass.